We're going to talk about rethinking pen testing strategy, which is a really elaborate title for I'm going to incoherently rant about pen testing for about half an hour. So pen testing strategy, I'm going to talk about the kinds of stuff that we do. I will very, very briefly introduce Secarma. They're not the point of this talk, and I'm not paid commission. I'll tell you who I work for. And then I'm just going to talk about pen testing and how it works and how it doesn't work. I was asked to include a case study in this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce the problems of pen testing and some of the kind of pitfalls as we go through. And then at the end, I'll discuss a recent engagement with a customer where they had several of those issues and why it can be such a problem and just such an inefficient way of working. And if anybody saw me ranting on LinkedIn this morning, what I was broadly talking about there was this idea that some organizations do pen testing in a certain way just because they've heard that that's how you're supposed to do it, or they've, oh, well, we've always done it like that, so presumably that's the best way. It isn't always the case. So rethinking your pen testing strategy isn't necessarily supposed to bring some groundbreaking new research into security testing's fundamentally changed. It's just like, hey, stop doing things just because you've always done them. And I think anyone who's seen me talk before will know that I am really not a fan of tying security testing to how many times you've been around the sun. It just seems entirely arbitrary. So we'll talk a little bit about frequency of testing, types of testing, those kinds of things. I will briefly introduce some terms for those people who maybe are non-technical managers or work in software testing, but not necessarily security testing. You've probably heard of them, so introducing things like red team engagements, that kind of thing, but just so that people are confident in how I'm using those terms and what I mean by them. It is true that I have been made the managing director of Secarma. Mistakes have been made. For those who see somebody who looks like me with a title like this, people seem to now presume that I work in sales and my background in sales. It's not at all. I am a pen tester, an ethical hacker. I used to introduce myself by saying that my name's Holly Gressel and I break into computers and buildings for a living. And now I guess I manage directors, which sounds slightly less cool, but I have a technical background. I'm an ethical hacker by trade. The reason that I introduced that, I'm not just showing off, is you can ask technical questions. Like, feel free in the chat to talk nuance and to talk detail if you'd like to. I'm going to give quite a high level glancing overview for those who are maybe not technical to keep everybody going along. But if there's something that comes up and you want to see the nitty gritty, or equally, if you disagree with something that is there, throw it in the chat and we'll talk about it. So I work for Secarma. Secarma advertise themselves as a cybersecurity consultancy because it sounds cool. We're a group of pen testers. We do ethical hacking. We are the breaking department. So what that means is a lot of the things that I'll be talking about aren't just necessarily my opinion, but that they're based in engagements that we do with customers. They're based in, I think this is a bad idea because we've seen it work inefficiently for customers previously. But that's enough about Secarma. What I'm going to talk about is security testing. Just in case we've got people who are kind of new to security testing and they've heard all of these terms, but they don't really know the specific distinctions. Or in case some people in the audience disagree with where I draw the lines, I'll give you my definitions and then you know what I'm talking about. And we can talk a little bit about why reasonable adults might disagree and why you might draw the line in a different place. I'm not going to talk about vulnerability scanning at all today, really, unless somebody in the chat like puts me under duress. I'm just going to talk about pen testing and red teaming, but I've included vulnerability scanning in here because I think it's pertinent to the spectrum of security testing. So anything vulnerability scanning, that side of things. In fact, if you think of security testing as a spectrum, on the furthest left, you have automated testing. There's a lot of products out there that can do this kind of thing: AppCheck, Nessus, Qualys' scanner, those kinds of things. You give it some target systems. That could be a list of IP addresses, a list of URLs, something like that. Click go, it finds some security vulnerabilities for you. I'm not going to talk about that stuff today. What we're going to concentrate on is moving further right in this spectrum. So just penetration testing and just red teaming. And I've included this slide just to give you where I draw the distinction. So penetration testing is a human-led, scope-restricted assessment of a system security where you aim to exploit vulnerabilities. So an organization would say, please do a pen test of our internal infrastructure. Please do a pen test of our web application, something like that. And the aim there is to go in, hack things, and show demonstrable risk. So if you're not exploiting vulnerabilities, if you're just finding the presence of a vulnerability, as far as I'm concerned, that's not a pen test. It's a vulnerability assessment. We're pushing left in the spectrum. This is distinct from a red team engagement. So we see red teams on the right here. Some people might prefer slightly different terms. You might say adversarial emulation or advanced security testing or something like that. Whatever your marketing department prefers, there is a second type of engagement that I'm going to refer to as a red team, which is a human-led, multi-technique engagement intended to assess an organization's response to an attack. So there's two big distinctions between pen test and a red team. The strongest one that I'm going to draw out throughout this presentation is a penetration test is an assessment of a system's security intended to find vulnerabilities. A red team is an assessment of an organization's response to a real-world attack. So what am I testing? The system security or the defensive team? In this context, the blue team. If people are curious about red team, blue team, OPFOR and that kind of thing, where those terminology comes from, there's a lot of things in security testing, there's a lot of things in hacking that are actually military terminology. It frustrates the hell out of me being ex-military, but red team, blue team typically comes from things like the US Air Force's wargaming. So there you go, if you've ever wondered why we keep using colors in these contexts. So to assess an organization's response, to assess can the blue team detect, has an attack taken place? What have the attackers been able to do? What has been compromised? What has been stolen? Those kinds of things. I'm also distinguishing here, as you can see highlighted in cyan, this multi-technique approach. So where I introduced penetration testing, I said we're going to hack a thing, so hack a website, hack infrastructure, something like that. With red teaming, we tend to be looking at multi-technique approaches. So using things like social engineering, using things like physical access. That doesn't mean if a pen test includes physical access testing, that it suddenly becomes a red team. It's just that that is typical of a red team. So where the adversary team, the red team themselves are deciding, holy witch service, you sound army, we'll get to that. Multi-technique, if you're including physical access, those kinds of things, where the adversary team are choosing which techniques to use themselves, that's pushing towards red teaming. If the customer is asking for specific things, setting specific limitations, and you are scope restricted, that's pen testing. You sound army, I am indeed Royal Signals. So I did stuff to computers for the military for a while. The army being the best one. So, so that's the kind of foundation there. Hopefully everybody sees pen testing, hacking stuff, red teaming, testing the blue team. What I'm going to do is I'm going to run through a series of questions to try and highlight, like, what are the problems that we're talking about? When we say, you know, rethinking your strategy, what is it that we're rethinking? What is it, the aspects of security testing that we're kind of revisiting? So the first is, what are you testing? And of course, this comes out of, are we doing a pen test or are we doing a red team? Because what I'm testing, be it the systems or the response, will greatly alter how I do the assessment, and it'll greatly alter what the value delivered to the company is. So if we take a look at a recent conversation that I had with a customer, one of the first things we'll do when we talk to a customer is like, what are you looking for? Are you looking for a list of vulnerabilities, or are you looking to see how well you would deal with a real world attack? If the answer to the question is the latter, how well would you deal with a real world attack? There's going to be a whole series of questions that come after that. What kind of attack? What kind of threat actor? Using what kind of capability? We're going to delve into threat modeling and threat intelligence and those kinds of things. If I am simulating a real world threat actor, or if you prefer hacking crew, whatever term's good for you, then which one, right? Because are we looking for bored teenagers in a basement and we're simulating those guys? Whilst they might not have a high capability in terms of financial backing, they've got a lot of time on their hands. Or are we looking at a nation state-based attack, a criminal group, a politically motivated attack, those kinds of things? So those questions are important. This quotation on the right, though, came from a customer recently where they thought what they wanted to do was a red team because they thought what they were looking for was to demonstrate that their IT team, their IT security team, weren't kitted out for detecting attacks. Now, that was not that their security team don't care. It's just that they didn't think they had the level of maturity to work out, you know, do they have a SIM that is working correctly? Do they have the correct level of observability into their software to see like what is happening? There's some funny things that we'll revisit around this as well, but it's one of those things like a lot of organizations, when they look at things like system logging, so what is happening on the system, will only log the bad things. So they'll have things like, oh, if somebody's doing a brute force attack, we need to know how many failed login attempts they've had, and then we can see if they're attacking us. And that's great, but that leads into the problem of if you're only logging bad things and you're only logging failed login attempts, what that will tell you is that an attack took place, but not if it was successful. So this is what we're talking about here is like, what are we trying to test? Like, what is the expected output from this? As it turned out for this particular customer that we'll revisit at the end when we talk about the case study, it actually turned out that they wanted a penetration test. They wanted just to go in, hack things, find vulnerabilities, but their expected output was that the IT team wouldn't notice. So it led to this wonderful quotation. It's like, just just do what you usually do. It'll probably not notice. So that was a funny thing, but it meant that their understanding of the output of pen testing versus red team was not necessarily correct. So we're looking at penetration testing. We're looking at like, what are we hacking and what are we doing? What are we trying to emulate effectively? The next question that comes up from a security testing point of view would be like, why are we testing? Like, what is the reason that you're engaging with a penetration testing company? And I've put this slide in here effectively under duress, because we work with a lot of customers and we get them to fill out what we call a pre-assessment questionnaire. You might not ever see a pre-assessment questionnaire. You might have a phone call with a salesperson. The salesperson fills those questions out through the discussion, or we might send you the form and you fill it out. But one of the questions on there will be, why are you testing? Like, what are you doing this for? And there's typically one of two answers. The first, very common answer, of course, is compliance reasons. We're testing because PCI 11.3 or something like that. We're testing because we've been told we need to test. And that's cool. We won't cover that today. But the other answer to this question is always best practice. We're testing because best practice. It might be, oh, we've just built a new system. It's about to go live, so we just want to test for best practice reasons. And best practice as an answer really frustrates me, because what it typically means is just like, we have a generic line in a policy somewhere that says we should do some testing sometimes. So I've sarcastically referred to this as like, everybody else is doing it, so we figured we'd do it. And it's really, really common when working with organizations through security testing to see them have some kind of line like this. So many organizations have security testing policy that states something like, we conduct penetration testing at least annually or after any major system change. This is the thing that frustrates me, and I guess this is the lead up to like why I wanted to do this conversation. It's like, why annually? Why not every 10 months or every 14 months? What has come up? Why have you gone with every 12 months? Is it the number of laps around the sun? After any major change, what does a major change mean to your organization? How do you define a major change? So if your organization is building a web application, for example, and you're building it in an agile way and you're doing sprints where you're making a large number of small changes very frequently, is major change a sensible kind of term to use in that context? Is a big test after a big period of time a sensible way of working in that regard? For a lot of organizations, it's not. And for a lot of organizations, it's not sensible for a couple of reasons. Very often these phrases are written where they're tied to changes in the organization, not necessarily changes in the threat landscape. Question from the chat. In your business, I imagine you have to deal with a lot of people who have no idea what security testing really is. How do you educate clients to a level that then allows them to think how to shape the assessment? One of the things that I do, which is possibly quite different to some security testers, some pen testers are really quite pedantic about terms and things like that. If a customer is describing the type of engagement that they want and the type of reasoning behind that engagement, and that's logical and well-founded, but they're using the wrong word to describe that, if they're describing the thing that they want, which is a pen test, but they're calling it a red team, then it'll deliver the thing that they want, and the thing that they want is a pen test, but they've maybe got confused about that terminology. It is very, very common that the people that we engage with, certainly in the initial stages around the commercial side of things, the agreement side of things, before we get to talk to the techies, might not really know the differences between security testing. I think everybody knows, broadly speaking, what security testing is, but those distinctions that we went through earlier between vulnerability analysis, pen testing, and red teaming, a lot of people don't know those nuances. Also, reasonable adults will disagree. I said a red team is a multi-technique assessment that involves assessing a blue team. For other people who work in the same field as me, they might just say, if there is a blue team, it is a red team assessment. They might draw the line slightly different. Reasonable adults disagree, that's completely fine. But the best thing to do is to work through these questions effectively with the stakeholders and say, what is that you're trying to assess and what is the output that you're looking for? Are you looking for a list of vulnerabilities, or are you looking for recommendations around response capabilities? I'll drill down a little bit on the idea of getting a list of vulnerabilities out of a system is also probably a bad thing. There's some more in here about rethinking strategy around how we report security testing. But yeah, to directly answer the question, I imagine you have to deal with a lot of people who have no idea what security testing really is. Yeah, it's pretty common, but we've been doing it a while and we can run them through the process of this is the kinds of testing and this is why the different ones are good. Also, for some organizations, you might want both. In fact, big organizations probably want all three. You probably should be doing red teaming if you've got a high level of maturity or a high level of sensitive data. You should be doing penetration testing to find vulnerabilities, but vulnerability scanning can be a cost-efficient way of finding the basic stuff. So doing that internally. So yeah, sometimes some organizations, depending on their scale, complexity, and budget, might want all three. It isn't necessarily that one is better than the other. Sometimes when you talk to pen testers, you maybe won't get that same answer from every pen tester, because some pen testers might say, yeah, but red teaming is better. Red teaming might be romanticized somewhat within the industry. It's certainly cooler. Red teaming is certainly cooler. It's certainly more realistic, but as to whether it's more valuable to your organization, it depends. So many organizations will perform testing annually, which is probably a bad thing. We'll get to schedules in a second. Most organizations will perform penetration testing of systems in isolation. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but I'll talk in a second about how that can lead to issues. Then many organizations will retest findings in isolation. So we might spend 4 weeks assessing a system, find hundreds and hundreds of vulnerabilities, and then they'll say, can you retest these 4 issues? Not necessarily a bad thing, of course, because if you want to know that the issue has been fixed, us retesting those 4 issues in isolation will tell you that. This user had a weak password. Has that user's password been changed? We can answer that question. But to what degree does that meaningfully change your risk exposure is a different question to, has this specific vulnerability been fixed? So that's the kind of thing we're talking about here. Digging down a little bit though, there's this idea of realistic versus real world. I mentioned it a second ago in terms of red teaming. So when we talk about red teaming, when we talk about adversarial emulation, when we talk about simulating a specific threat actor, a lot of it comes down to which threat actor would you like us to simulate. On the flip side, some organizations get really, really dug deep into this assessment needs to be as realistic as possible without really understanding necessarily what that means. So for example, it's really not uncommon when doing an engagement with a customer for them to not want to disclose information to us because they want the assessment to be as realistic as possible. So this is honestly not even a contrived situation. This is like a common thing that comes up with customers. And allow me to explain to you why this is sometimes a silly idea. And this is just one example of this kind of thing. So where we'll go to do an internal infrastructure assessment. So internal infrastructure, for those who are unfamiliar with that terminology, we're typically simulating what could a malicious member of staff do? What could somebody who has access to the building plug something into the network and assesses the internal network could do? What's the risk of guests, visitors, contractors, those kinds of things? When we do one of those infrastructure assessments, one of the things I'll do is sit down with the organization. I'll talk them through things like how disruption during penetration testing is really rare, but how to manage it if it occurs. Things like when I go for lunch, what to do if you think there's a problem in your network that was caused by me, exchanging emergency contact information, those kinds of things. One of the things that will happen is I'll ask questions like, what's your internal address space? Which areas of the network would you like me to concentrate on? Is there specific risks that you would like me to explore? Do you have known vulnerabilities that you would like more, like an independent view on, that kind of thing? Very often we'll say something like, what's your internal address space? And they'll say, oh, I'm not telling you, a real hacker would find it out themselves. Well, yeah, I can. Like port scanning and network mapping and enumeration and intelligence gathering is not hard, but it's time consuming. And I absolutely can set off a port scan, then go to Starbucks if that's what you want me to do. But is it cost efficient? Is it time efficient? Those kinds of things. So this is what I'm talking about here when we look at like, what are we testing? Why are we testing? How are we testing? These questions. In this regard, yes, if you think there is value to you in me taking an entirely what we traditionally refer to as black box approach, so having no internal network knowledge prior to the assessment and seeing how far I can go, yeah, I can do that. And to be honest, from my point of view, it can sometimes be quite fun to demonstrate the fact that I knew nothing about your organization, yet I was still able to compromise you. But you're going to needlessly slow me down. And if you just want a list of vulnerabilities, if you just want to know the state of the system, those kinds of things, then, give us a nudge in the right direction. Sometimes people fixate on this. I used the term a second ago, black box approach. And there is, of course, a counter approach, a white box approach, which is where we'd be fully informed, likely working with the software developers or those kinds of things. You don't need to drill down on that too much at all. What are you trying to get out of the assessment, and then optimize the assessment for that?
I was going to say, sorry, Holly, with that. So with what you just mentioned, if they sort of like drag out that whole process, or how does it actually work? So would you get a certain amount of would you get paid for doing one particular thing, or would you get paid like per day, or how would it actually work? So would
We can revisit the how you pay, because of course I can talk about us as penetration testers where we deliver a consultancy model where you're basically paying for days of engineering time.
Right.
But there's also the counterpoint around things like bug bounties and those kinds of things.
Right.
And with bug bounties, you typically pay per finding, but the same weaknesses occur. Are you actually just allowing loads of people to spend loads of time doing mapping and those kinds of things when you could get them a little bit further ahead? I'll give you another example that's not tied to internal infrastructure for people who maybe build applications, write software, those kinds of things. If you write a API, an application programming interface, and you want us to assess that, we could be given, the IP address of the API and just start sending requests to it and try and work out what it does, what its endpoints are, how to communicate with it, those kinds of things. Or you could give us a Swagger file, which tells us where the endpoints are, what parameters it's expecting, what the input types are, those kinds of things. And we'll work that stuff out eventually, especially if there's an application that consumes that API where we could just watch what the application's doing. But what you're doing is you're making it faster. So we're just skipping the first step. Oops. So, one of the things with penetration testing, security testing, is that I want to say it's seasonal. Like the time of year matters. What I mean by this is, if you're doing security testing annually and you're resting your entire understanding of your risk exposure on, we did this assessment at this time of the year, and therefore this is our risk, your exposure changes throughout the year. So again, this is a vulnerability that came about from the case study customer that I'll talk about in depth in a little while. But they had a penetration test, and they did do it annually. We came in, and this company have certain policies around the way that they do security testing. So one of the things, for example, we install all security updates every 30 days. They have some policy that says how frequently they do patching. It just so happened that during the time of that assessment, a series of vulnerabilities, these are just two, but a series of vulnerabilities had just been released. The particular vulnerabilities that I'm talking about now are in a system called Citrix ShareFile. So for that organization, this is an internet-facing system that is missing 3 patches, but those 2 are the particularly pertinent ones. And it was within their 30-day patching cycle. So these vulnerabilities had been out for 14, 15, 16 days, something like that, but they hadn't gotten around to patching them because they do all of their patches every 30 days. And what the end result of that, what those vulnerabilities allowed for, was for us to compromise that system and gain access to their internal network. Now, from their point of view, when we reported those vulnerabilities, they initially, having the "we've always done it this way" hat on, said, yeah, but we would patch those vulnerabilities eventually. In 2 weeks' time, those vulnerabilities would have been patched. It's like, well, yeah, but that's 30 days of exposure. So there's 2 issues here. The first is doing security testing on a schedule doesn't work, but also doing things like remedial action on a schedule doesn't work. If you have all patches are treated the same and they are all installed every 30 days. Some patches are worse than others. Some vulnerabilities are worse than others. So, you'll see this in Microsoft Windows patches, for example. They actually grade their patches. So they have critical, important, and then they have kind of regular patching as well for just like best practice. You should get around to this. And your patching cycle should allow for that. To the same degree, I'll talk more in depth in a second, but depending on how your penetration testers are writing reports or how your vulnerability scanners are grading vulnerabilities, starting at the highs and working your way down to the lows, surprisingly might not necessarily be the best approach. I'll talk about that in a second. For those who want to jump the story, vulnerability chaining, 2 or 3 low impact vulnerabilities could become a high impact issue if combined together. So treating vulnerabilities just on their individual grading can be inherently flawed. But the point of this slide, what I'm trying to point out here is your exposure changes. If you make a new release, before that release is tested, your exposure is potentially going to be higher before you find out about those vulnerabilities. If you have systems that are internet facing, systems that are exposed in some way, and you have a generic patching cycle that just says we install these patches on this timeline, your exposure is going to fluctuate, and your security testing should allow for that in some way. So if you're doing annual testing, and as it turned out, this organization had a vulnerability scanner, and that vulnerability scanner has a plugin for those 2 vulnerabilities that I mentioned. For some reason, their vulnerability scanner didn't pick up that vulnerability. I don't want to dwell too much on this because, the penetration tells you that vulnerability scanners are flawed. There's some bias there from my part, of course. It's called job security if I tell you that vulnerability scanners aren't very good. But it happened that in this case, it didn't find the vulnerability. And that happens. Sometimes that can be just because they're not intelligent systems, and sometimes there's some issue just in the way that they detect, or maybe their signature is somewhat flawed. Or of course, if you want to see extreme examples of this, look at the Equifax breach, right? Equifax had a vulnerability scanner. It didn't find the vulnerability in that instance due to some, I'm going to broadly gloss over that as configuration issue, but they screwed something up. It wasn't finding vulnerabilities. So they're not perfect solutions. You know, you don't click go in a vulnerability scanner and that's it. That's security testing addressed, in the same way that you don't just install an antivirus solution and then that's it. That's cybersecurity defense completely covered. So sometimes you need an overlap between these things. But it happened in this case that the vulnerability was released, and then within a couple of weeks, they had a scheduled pen test, their annual pen test. We found the vulnerability and the risk was closed. In fact, they had it patched before the next day. I did something like, I think I reported the vulnerability to them, something like 4 p.m. on the Friday. By the time I'd started work at 9 a.m. the day after, sorry, Thursday to Friday, they'd patched the thing. So the fix was really quick. It was literally install and update, a little bit of a configuration change. But if that scheduled test hadn't happened to land in that window, they could have been exposed for a lot longer. If the patch wasn't applied, if they didn't know about this system. You know, a lot of organizations are very good at patching their Windows systems, but maybe not necessarily good at patching their frameworks, libraries, those kinds of things. They could have been there for a long time. I guess the extreme case would be if they'd just had a pen test, that vulnerability was introduced, and it was all the way until their next pen test before it got picked up. It could have been pretty bad. Great vulnerability, though, allows for perimeter break. So we've been through a few different things as effectively like, how are we testing? So this is the middle ground between penetration testing and red teaming. So what I spoke about earlier is red teaming is multi-techniques. It's very frequent that in red teaming, we would look at social engineering using phishing emails, contacting members of staff, that kind of thing. It might be multi-technique in terms of it involves physical access, those kinds of things. For a lot of organizations, they might not be at the level of maturity where they think they're ready for a red team engagement. A lot of organizations take the stance that, well, if we had a red team, they'd just compromise us and we wouldn't get any value from that report. There's no point doing an assessment that you know you're going to fail, is some stance that some organizations have. And that's fair enough if they're on that journey of maturity and they're not quite at that very high level yet where a red team might be beneficial to them. But that doesn't mean that they need to rely on annualized pen testing. And that's it. We just do testing once a year because we're not at the level yet. So you could find that middle ground. So for example, I guess one of the things that frustrates me is you can combine types of testing, and you should. It is completely fine to test systems in isolation. I'll talk about one of the benefits of that in a second, but you can also combine testing as well. If you have external infrastructure and you want to combine phishing with that security assessment, probably a good thing. Also, physical access testing is awesome. It's the trespass side of my job, and a lot of organizations very often find that they put loads of effort into their network security, perimeter security, system security. That all falls down terribly when somebody has access to the building. But I'll revisit it. So recently, an organization that I was working with, it came to their annual pen test. They were like, okay, 1 year has passed. It's now our time of the year to reassess everything. I did something like 6 weeks of testing with them. They were a very big organization. They have something like 12,000 endpoints on their network. So it's a huge network. Did external infrastructure testing, internal infrastructure testing, build reviews, web application testing. We went through everything. We went through everything back to back to back because they do annual testing and a year had passed. So they do it all together. This was horrendous for me, as you can see on the right-hand side of this slide, where it's like, do 4 weeks of testing, try not to cry whilst writing a 284-page report. That was exactly how big that report for that company was. It was a 284-page report because I'd assessed so much and found so many weaknesses. So this is a problem for a couple of reasons. The first being, if you are testing in this way, where you do loads of testing and then at the end you get your report, that's probably not a good thing. Because if I find a vulnerability on June 1st and you don't find out about it until the 3rd of July, because that's where the reporting is, that's a bad thing. So there's a communications process issue here about, as the security assessment is going on, how do you make sure that your team finds out about those vulnerabilities? How do you connect the dev team with the pen tester so that when the pen tester finds a vulnerability, they can tell the dev team about it quickly? And whilst you might not get a formal report with an executive summary and all of those kinds of things, it might just be enough to say, hey, this function is vulnerable in this way, to allow the dev team a head start on fixing it. Also, as much as a pain as it was for me to write a 284-page PDF report, how manageable is that to the organization? How manageable is this way of traditionally doing security testing, where we come in, absolutely ruin the network, give you a 300-page report and say, see you next year? Because that is how some organizations are doing security testing. And frankly, I absolutely love it, because I go in, I ruin a FTSE 250 and I say, see you in a year. And then they spend 11.5 months doing remedial action. And then in 11.5 months, it turns out they screwed something up because security defense is difficult. And then I hack into them again. The point being here, doing things annually is bad because annually can be a long time between security testing. But it also can be bad in terms of if you're trying to assess everything at the same time, the output might be unmanageable. So breaking things down in some way might be better. For this particular organization, one of their inherent flaws was their internal network was flat. Basically, there was no network segmentation or separation between systems. So one of the findings of the report was you should make propagation across the network harder. You should use internal firewalling. And getting that right can be quite difficult. So waiting until the next year for the next assessment to see if they got it right probably wouldn't work. So problems of annualized penetration testing, you're doing a huge amount of security testing work at the same time, can be unmanageable reports. But on the flip side, if you separate testing down into individual testing, where we just test this website and then this website and then this infrastructure, and then we do a social engineering test, the output of each report can influence the findings of the next report. So the example I've got here is a really simple one, but hopefully it gives you the understanding is, if you say to us, please do a pen test of this website, and that website has a login box or something like that. To bypass that login box, we have some options. We can do brute force attacks, credential stuffing. We can look to see if a recent breach has occurred where a user has reused a password on the login box, those kinds of things. But is that what a real world threat actor would do? Absolutely not. If I was a criminal, I'd probably just send some phishing emails to your staff, and if any of them give me a password, then that's how I would get through. So separating things down helps on one hand, but it can hinder on the other. So it's something that needs thought. That's the point that I'm trying to put out here. Question from the chat. I know this is a very wide question. Do you have any guides on a good approach to security testing? I have to use a third party that I have no choice about using, but I want to be able to ensure that they're doing a good job and not just milking us for money. There's two questions here, really. A guide on getting good security testing from a methodology point of view, and then a guide on working out, are our security testing vendor doing what they should? It can be quite difficult. One of the things to look for is the security testing vendor should be comfortable talking about their methodology. They should be comfortable about talking through how they actually perform security testing. The methodologies that they use, the way that they're approaching security can differ greatly depending on whether they're looking at applications, whether they're looking at infrastructure, those kinds of things. If you're looking at web applications, then there's things like, so for web applications, people may be aware of OWASP, the Open Web Application Security Project. Everybody, when it comes to web applications, seems to have heard of the OWASP Top 10, which is the 10 vulnerabilities that you should care about. There's many other OWASP projects as well. And in this context, a good one to look at would be the Application Security Verification Standard, ASVS. That talks about finding vulnerabilities in applications and can talk you through methodologies, those kinds of things. When it comes to infrastructure security, there's not a good guide that I know of necessarily from a business point of view, but definitely one of the things I would talk to the vendor about is how do they approach system testing in terms of, are they testing servers in isolation, or are they looking at underlying systems? So if I'm testing a Windows Active Directory domain, for example, most of the really good stuff is going to be weaknesses in Active Directory, not necessarily weaknesses in the systems themselves. When it comes to build reviews, hardening systems, those kinds of things, there's things like the CIS benchmarks. But no, as an overall guide on a good approach to security testing, there isn't a published one that I know of. There's a book deal in that for somebody, I'm sure. So individual testing can be bad because if you're not allowing the tester to perform security testing techniques, you're restricting them. If I get a login page and I'm not allowed to do phishing attacks, you're restricting me. On the other side here as well, I mentioned things like sometimes you can just restrict us based on time. So if I'm able to perform a brute force attack, if there is a login interface that doesn't have account lockout, rate limiting, something like that, I could brute force that. I might feasibly be able to find a password. But if the assessment is very short, an individual test of just those pages or just those systems, I might just not have time. I compromised a academic system a few months ago. There was a brute force involved in that. Turns out that their system, their remote portal, where their staff kind of do inter-staff messaging, scheduling, file transfer, those kinds of things, didn't have account lockout on it. They also didn't have any way of monitoring if a brute force attack was taking place. When I was able to find that, I performed a brute force attack of that portal. It took 4, 5 days, and then eventually I compromised a password, and they had no idea that that had happened. So yeah, isolating individually can be bad for a couple of different ways. The last thing, I guess the last thing before I start talking about like the case study and tying all of this stuff together would be talking to the security assessor, talking to the security tester about like, how do they win? What are you expecting the output to be? So this is similar to what I was talking about earlier in terms of pen testing and red teaming, but I mean to a more granular level. So very frequently when we talk to customers, if we're looking at getting access to applications or something like that, they might have some flag or some goal where they consider the assessment to have effectively failed unless you achieve this line. And that line might be entirely arbitrary. So I was talking to a customer earlier that have a web application, and they were saying like, oh, unless you compromise an admin account, you know, that we don't care. It's like, it's just privilege escalation. It's just admin accounts that we care about. But if we found a vulnerability that does allow us to steal a lot of confidential information, sensitive information, personal information under GDPR, that kind of thing, that would be a really bad thing for the company. But from their mentality, their viewpoint, if it wasn't the compromise of an admin account, they didn't care. Give you another example on the infrastructure side of things. An organization that is assessing, I'll talk very briefly about this case study side of things, but this is all the same organization we're talking about throughout. I was able to compromise the perimeter using the Citrix share file vulnerability I mentioned earlier that allowed me a foothold into the network. I was able to pivot across the network due to a reused local administrator password. This is not the same local admin password on every machine. It was just a couple of machines that obviously been set up by the same person, and that person had used the same admin password. So I think I'd compromised 2 or 3 machines. I found where a domain admin was logged in. I stole their token. I escalated to domain administrative level and is able to compromise the full network. That's fairly typical of what we would try and do on an infrastructure assessment. And that's very often what the customers expect us to do. If you don't compromise domain admin, then, well, you haven't demonstrated risk. This organization, though, this wasn't necessarily what I actually did. It wasn't the domain control we were going for. What we did instead was we compromised one server. Now, I mentioned earlier, they have 12,000 endpoints on the network, so several thousand servers, several thousand end user devices, and then media systems, CCTV cameras, all sorts, incredibly huge network. Compromised one server, and the server that we compromised is called an EFT, it's a file transfer system. It's the payment processing server. We gained access to the one server that handles payment cards, and that allowed us to steal around 16,000 payment cards per hour. That's not 24 hours a day, of course, that's whilst the retail side of the business is operating. 16,000 cards per hour counts up really quickly. And when we discussed this with the business, they were really surprised that we had just gone for one server and we'd compromised one server, we put all of that effort in. But the risk is significant. So what I'm talking about here is like discussing with the testing team, like how do they win? What is the bad thing for you? I guess there's some extreme examples to talk about here as well. I talked to a steel recycling company a little while ago, this a few years ago now. And one of the things I did at the beginning of an assessment, I said like, okay, you know, how do I win? What is it that you would like me to demonstrate? What's the risk that you're worried about? And their IT manager turned around and said, well, whilst it would be inconvenient, I think if you shut all of our computers down for a couple of weeks, we could probably still operate, because that kind of business, if they really needed to, could operate on paper. So from that point of view, you know, trying to work out how to impact that business to some strong degree, it's a very, very different approach to just, you know, compromise an admin account, compromise some servers, those kinds of things. So actually discussing with the organization is like, how do I demonstrate risk to you would be a big thing. Now, from his point of view, of course, he was thinking of defensively of his internal network, and he's thinking, hey, if we shut all the computers down, we wouldn't care. We'd just go back to working on paper. What if I defaced their public website? What if I put a politically motivated message on their public website or something about their company being awful or something like that? In their instance, it might have been brand damage. That was the big thing, but it wasn't where their headspace is at. It wasn't what they were thinking about. They were thinking about, oh, we don't really need computers. They're not important to us. What if we were able to impact their payment processing system in a similar attack to this? Like, okay, their computers operating or whatever, but if we can steal money from their account, for the most part, for most organizations, whilst you might not consider computing that important, you might not consider some systems that important, if we can steal money, it's typically fairly easy to show business risk. But how do you win? Is one thing together. So in the last couple of minutes, fitting it all together, all of these slides have all been, it turns out, the same organization. They made all of these same mistakes, and they're now doing something different. So it turns out with this organization, they had a public-facing system, the Citrix share file that I mentioned earlier. And I was able to compromise that system with that known vulnerability. Another example of the same kind of thing, I found one of their portals. It was an old portal. You might recognize the fact that it's running Office 2013. And I think the server itself was like a 2008 server, something like that. But it was just, it's still there because it hadn't been decommissioned. And well, we needed to turn it off because we're using the new VPN now, but we haven't actually turned off the old one, so it's still available. I did this assessment a couple of months ago, and it turned out I was able to compromise a user account with lockdown 2020 as the password. And I just thought that was a really great example of that point that I was making earlier, that your security exposure changes over time. If you did an assessment today, all of your staff members might be using good passwords, and then somebody changes their password to lockdown 2020, and that's easy to guess. You might have a really dedicated internal team where everybody's operating for the best of the business. And maybe you fire somebody and now you've got a disgruntled member of staff, and that impacts things. But yeah, good hit, broke the perimeter using lockdown 2020. This allowed me access to internal systems. I could access Adobe Reader, the Office systems, those kinds of things. This is a really interesting quirk of the way that Windows RDS, Microsoft RDS, that software works. If you access any of those icons that we saw in the previous slide, you see it's got like the file open here, so I can view files, I can read PDFs, those kinds of things. And if you do open, it opens a little Explorer window, but that Explorer window is actually on the server. So if you type commands or try and open files, that actually happens server side. So I was able to open a command line on the remote server because they just never thought this is how this worked. Whenever they'd had this assessed previously, they'd done that assessment in isolation. The assessment had reported things like, hey, this is a Windows Server 2008 machine, you should probably turn it off. You're using Office 2013, that's an end-of-life software, you should upgrade the Office. But that assessor had never been given the freedom to then try and target the internal network. So this is the second weakness, wasn't it? It's like testing systems in isolation. Now that I've given the freedom of like, hey, I can hack this system to get access to other things, I'm on the internal network and I can start messing with things. On the internal network, like I say, we aimed straight for the payment processing machine. They had all of their monitoring, all of their SIM, all of their blue team monitoring the Active Directory system, looking for has somebody compromised an account, is somebody trying to do exploits across the network, those kinds of things. Because we compromised one server, it wasn't like a big or broad enough attack to kind of set the alarms off. So they missed that because of a presumption around how testing works and the methodology in use. Gained access to the EFT server. A funny thing, it actually turned out afterwards, and it's worth pointing this out, that the password to the local admin account of their payment processing server was basically the word password. The reason this is worth pointing out, other than, wow, that's a hilariously bad password, is that wasn't how we gained access. And the reason for that was they had account lockout. So it was something like you got 5 password attempts, and if you didn't guess it within 5 attempts, it would lock the account. So we didn't do brute forcing. I exploited it through a different means and gained access through a different means. So sometimes the tester's methodology won't find all vulnerabilities. A penetration test will not find every vulnerability on a system. It will just be representative of the methodology that that tester is following. So sometimes we might assess a system in a certain way and effectively miss a vulnerability like this, which could surprise some people. So it's worth understanding how penetration testing happens. But if I am spending a lot of time, if we're pushing towards red teaming and I'm trying not to be detected, I'm probably not going to be doing brute force attacks. And therefore, I'm probably not going to find weaknesses like this. I would imagine your organization wants to know about weaknesses like this. So that's why, how are we testing? Is it pen testing? Is it red teaming? Is it vulnerability scanning? Is super important. because the end result was there's still a couple of 100,000 payment cards. And then the end result was everything that comes after a successful compromise. This is effectively the last slide, and it's kind of the last point to leave you on. Most organizations do security testing up to and including what happens when you exploit the vulnerability, but no further. We've written a web application. Can you have it disclose personal information? Yes or no, we could find a vulnerability that can disclose that. But what does the threat actor do next? It's worth, in the very least, having a thought exercise over, in the very least doing like a tabletop exercise, like a war game or something like that, if you're not able to go through the whole process of actually what happens. Because in this case, we compromised the payment server. We could gather 16,000 payment cards per hour. And what the result of that meant was we wanted to stay on the network for a long time. The longer we stayed on the network, the more payment cards we stole. So what we ended up doing was compromising the DVRs. I've missed DVR off the end of this slide, so apologies for that. But DVR, CCTV system, that's why the little eye icon is being used here. We hacked the server, gained access to it, and then hacked the DVR for our long-term persistence. So if they come through and say, hey, this machine seems to have been infected, or there's some log telling them that machine has been compromised in some way, a sensible thing for an organization to do might be to quarantine that machine, rebuild it, change the passwords, those kinds of things. And that company might think they've kicked us off the network. Turns out we're hanging out in the CCTV systems, because whilst you don't think of CCTV as computers, these days they pretty much are. They're very often, this particular example, it was an embedded Linux installation. It's just like a little server, right? So we got persistence in there. So if you don't think of what could happen next, you're missing an awful lot of weaknesses. If we're able to steal a load of passwords from your web application, where are those passwords then otherwise valid? Is your organization even the target, or are we just trying to steal your staff passwords to then try those same passwords on their PayPal accounts and steal all of the money from your staff members or something like that? Maybe you care less about staff-specific vulnerabilities, but we've been talking a lot in penetration testing over the last few years about supply chain attacks, right? Your organization might not be the end goal for this threat actor. You might just be caught up because they're looking to compromise someone else, or you're a supplier of them, or those kinds of things. So don't think of pen testing as ending when the pen tester is successful or not successful. Think through right until the end. It's like, okay, what would the threat actor do next? If a threat actor had compromised our network to this degree, if a hacker in this case had gained access to our payment card system, how would we get rid of them? In this particular case, they completely would have missed us. When we walked through the wargaming with them, the end is like, okay, now that you know that you're compromised and you know what we've done, how we've done it, which systems we've compromised, they'd have cleaned everything up, rebuilt everything, changed all their account passwords, and we're still in their network. So it's worth thinking right through to the end. So, you know, it doesn't end with running some web application vulnerabilities. There's some incident detection and then minimizing impact stuff that comes after that. And that's it. Very quick summary for my last kind of minute. Point in time assessments don't represent the overall ongoing risk profile of an organization. Things change throughout the year. That staff member, when they changed their password to lockdown 2020, physically changed the risk exposure of that organization. If you have a patching cycle that's every 30 days or something like that, your risk will fluctuate. And if you are building systems in an agile manner, if you're doing sprints but are testing annually, it's probably not going to work out very well. Cool hacks are awesome. 0 days are cool, those kinds of things. But the benefit doesn't come through cool hacks. The benefit comes through explaining business risk to the organization. You know, it's no good to say, hey, we compromised a domain administrative account if you're talking to a CEO, because the CEO is probably going to say, what's a domain admin? But if you can demonstrate risk through, we stole this many payment cards, we access these systems, that's better. And it's worth thinking through that, both from a security testing point of view, but also when you're designing your security testing. How do we optimize this assessment so that it demonstrates business risk to the business leaders so they understand why we're doing it and why we're spending money? PDF reports are slow and manageable, and neither tester or customer wants them. A 300-page PDF report is probably not going to help you. So think about your organization. What would help you? Different companies we work with in different ways. Some of the organizations, we don't write a formal report for them. We just open tickets in their ticket management system, their Threadfix or Jira or whatever. So think of how would you like to work with the testing team? I mentioned earlier as well, some companies will effectively have a Slack chat open with the developers. And when we find a vulnerability, we'll talk directly to the developers about that issue so they can start fixing it as we go through. Penetration tests are restricted due to being a point-in-time assessment, but also the exploitation path. When you're optimizing the assessment, make sure that you discuss with the tester, how are we assessing this? Are we trying to find as many vulnerabilities as possible? Are we going to try and go without being detected? Are we trying to get an admin account? Are we just trying to demonstrate business risk? It's worth talking through what is the how do we win slides that I mentioned earlier. And red teaming might be more interesting to the consultant, but it doesn't mean that it's more valuable to the customer. So think very much in depth of like, what are you trying to get out of this testing? And just finding individual vulnerabilities, it's probably not actually what you want. You probably want a full risk exposure of how does this system affect our organization? How does this system affect our customers? And thinking past the specific vulnerability into, can this be chained with other vulnerabilities? What is the end goal for the threat actor? If this system was compromised to this level, how do we get the hackers back out? And that's everything. Thanks for listening.
Awesome. Thank you very much for that, Holly. Yeah, really, really interesting. And I hope everyone else enjoyed that. Again, any sort of questions, feel free to pop them in the at the bottom. But just before we move on, so with so whilst people are sort of thinking of questions, if they want to ask any, I guess if you had the sort of annual pen test and then you did it sort of more frequently, what would the sort of difference in cost be? So say if you were to do it after every release, would it be significantly higher, but just minimal risk, or how would it actually work?
It matters entirely in the context of the business, right? So some organizations will do a baseline assessment of the current state of the system. So if they have a application that's currently live and they're doing iterative changes to it, we'll do a baseline, and then effectively we'll do assessments following on from that based on their change log. So there's a customer that I work with quarterly, but they don't have more testing. They just have testing spread out through the year based on the things the developers are working on. There's also a thing to talk about here in terms of testing is one thing. To see if you've built something well is one thing, but also getting feedback from the testing company in terms of like, are you designing this thing correctly? So if you're not at the stage where you have a system that's live that can be assessed, it's like getting a pen tester involved at an earlier stage in the development lifecycle of like how you're building this and then how testing should work around that. So it isn't necessarily that testing in a more modern way needs to be more expensive. It should just be more closely aligned with how you're building the systems, how you're building things. So annual is bad, more frequent is better, balance to be had there. On any major change, well, if you're not having major changes, if you're having lots of minor changes, having some thought around that of, okay, how many minor changes becomes a major, or tying the testing into the development lifecycle so the testers are really aware of what happens. But like I say, one of my customers, I literally work on their change log. That's the start of my assessment is, what if you change this quarter, and I'll go and test that.
I was going to say, do you reckon that could come down to sort of lack of education from organizations? So say if they just think at Secarma and think, oh, we can just get a penetration test rather than like continuous support sort of moving forward. Do you reckon that could be an issue?
It's an education awareness thing, definitely, but what it is it's customers thinking of penetration testing as a commoditized service. And to be honest, it certainly can be. If you want an off-the-shelf pen test, there's companies out there that will provide that for you. But all we're asking throughout this slide deck is just think about, what are you optimizing for? What are you looking for the output for this pen test to be? And then that will drive some of the questions within the assessment. Some companies, and certainly a lot of companies who build systems or run systems, aren't really thinking to like the in-depth level, the cool side of pen testing as we are. What they're thinking is, we have a thing, it's valuable to us, we don't really want someone hacking it, and we want to have a conversation around securing that. If they come to us directly, we can have those conversations really easily, but think of the way that you procure services. If you're going the tender route and you put out a request for quote to 3 different companies, you're not having those in-depth conversations with the testing company about like, how should this testing be delivered? So that's the whole point from the title, right? It's just like rethink that approach, just rethink how you're doing those things. And commercial decisions can impact the output and the value of a security test. The way that you do it can impact it. But yeah, just try and work out from a company point of view, it's like, what are we optimizing for? And then do that.
For sure. I think we've had a question from Tony. Can you see that, Ollie?
Yeah, so this is a wonderful one. How can an organization address all of the different variables you talked about? To do so would cost a fortune. So how do you degree a compromise of risk versus cost of the customers? That's a brilliant question in terms of, when you get to the end of a presentation like this, it sounds like what I've said is you need continuous pen testing, where it's like every single day there is a pen tester working on this. And there's some different approaches. So depending on the maturity of the organization, the type of system, we can gain benefits elsewhere. So we haven't talked throughout this presentation about automation. I mentioned vulnerability scanning, and I said vulnerability scanning is an automated approach. That's not the only way. So one of the things that company that I mentioned a second ago, where I basically use their change log to kind of inform testing. One of the things that I have with them is some automation systems that check to see if parts of their system have changed, and if they haven't meaningfully changed, then I've assessed them previously. So there's no reason to go back in there, kind of thing. I have automation for some customers that can check for things like patch regression. So we're making retesting way more efficient, those kinds of things. But yeah, automation is not a bad thing in terms of security testing, and it can gain cost efficiencies. There is at some point though, this question is completely fair, and there is at some point where you have to do cost benefit analysis, and you have to say, well, we want to run, you know, weekly vulnerability scans, quarterly pen tests, biannual segmentation tests, and a yearly red team. But doing all of this would cost so much. So how do we make sure that we get the balance right? And the thing there would be, what is it that you're looking for the output to be? Where do you need the value to be? If you are looking at something like, so I mentioned at the very end of the presentation, you need to make sure that you're minimizing impact, right? So if a hacker gains access, how do you get them back out? I talked in this presentation, in this context, about doing a red team assessment to do that, right? A red team assessment might be 100 days engagement with consultants. It might involve more than one consultant. That'd be incredibly expensive engagement for many organizations. Alternatively, you could do a tabletop scenario. You could sit down with your business continuity plan. You could say, okay, attackers have got this far using this technique. What would we do next? And you can run it through as a wargaming scenario. You're doing the same thing, you're working through the same steps, but on one hand, you've got a 200-day engagement involving a team of consultants, and on the other side, you've got probably a 4-hour meeting with some of the business stakeholders. There's different ways of assessing things to different degrees of granularity. It's a cost-benefit problem, that's what it is, yeah. How do you agree a compromise of risk versus cost? Yeah, that's honestly it. You've got to say, what is your business's risk appetite? The risk appetite should come from the board. The board should be able to say, this is the level of risk that we're willing to operate with. A lot of companies don't have those kinds of things defined well, but yeah, that's the problem. Cost benefit analysis.